Once again, I had driven this road in Missouri countless times, but somehow that evening, it felt strangely unsettling. My partner was dozing beside me, leaving me alone with the darkness outside. The constant swish of the wipers and the endless twists in the road were accompanied by a soft, misty rain. The windshield was hazy, and the fog built up in thick patches, forcing me to lean forward, as if it might help me see better through the haze. Something about that night made me feel exposed. It wasn't just the weather, though the winding roads and slippery pavement didn't help, but a heavy, unsettling silence in the air. No other cars seemed brave enough to venture down this stretch of highway. Every time I glanced at the rearview mirror, I half expected to see headlights, just to reassure myself that we weren't the only ones on this lonely road. But there was only emptiness behind me. Every few miles, the fog would clear, and the headlights would reveal glimpses of towering trees, bending in close on either side, forming a tunnel of branches with dripping leaves. The occasional sign, wet and reflective, was the only reminder we were still on a state highway. Otherwise, I might have thought we'd wandered onto a deserted back road with no end in sight. The crackling static on the radio didn't help calm my nerves. Each pop or hiss felt like a whisper, as if something unseen was waiting just beyond my line of sight. I tried not to wake my partner. He had been exhausted, and there was no point in both of us suffering through the drive. Still, a part of me wanted to nudge him, tell him something about this place just didn't feel right. But I kept quiet, glued to the road, breathing shallowly each time I rounded another sharp curve. At one particularly tight bend, the trees felt almost uncomfortably close. The headlights barely lit up the road ahead, leaving the rest of the world swallowed by darkness. Then, off to the left, I noticed movement in my peripheral vision, about 20 feet away. Something enormous seemed to emerge from the tree line. At first, my mind refused to accept what I was seeing. It was as though an entire tree had stepped out from the forest. A surge of unease shot through me, and I gripped the steering wheel tightly, my knuckles aching. My brain scrambled for an explanation. Maybe the fog was playing tricks on me. Perhaps it was just a wind-blown branch. But this thing was massive, taller than anything natural should be. It seemed to disappear into the darkness in one fluid motion. One moment it was there, towering above, and the next it was gone. I wanted to slam on the brakes to get a better look, but I was afraid the car might skid on the slick asphalt. Besides, there was no shoulder to pull onto, and the visibility behind me was non-existent. For a few moments, I questioned my own eyes. A part of me screamed that it was just the fog, but another part of me insisted I had just seen something that didn't belong in the forest. My breath quickened as I pushed the accelerator, instinctively wanting to get away. Each second dragged until I saw the flickering lights of a motel in the distance. It looked like a tiny beacon of safety, a reminder that civilization still existed. I exhaled, trying to convince myself that I had simply let my mind wander. Maybe the gloom had twisted an ordinary tree trunk into something monstrous. But then the doubt returned. I had seen it move. It hadn't swayed like branches in the wind. It had slunk back the way a tall person might step behind a wall, except this thing was as tall as a 3-story building, maybe taller. No way that was normal. I thought about stopping at the motel, but it seemed deserted, with only a few rooms and the lights off. It didn't feel any safer than the open road, so I kept going. My partner stirred in his seat, mumbling something about the rain, then went back to dozing. For a moment, I envied him. I would have given anything to feel as relaxed as he looked. We continued on, the road twisting again beneath a canopy of dripping leaves. My eyes kept darting to the side, half expecting to see that towering shape again. Every time the wind rustled the branches, my heart raced, but the trees refused to reveal any secrets. We eventually passed a rundown diner with all its lights off. It was as desolate as the motel, but the parking lot offered a place to stop. I pulled in briefly to calm my nerves. My partner blinked awake and asked if everything was okay. I wanted to tell him, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, I just stared at the dripping overhang above the diner's door, half expecting that giant figure to step out from behind the building. We didn't stay long, and soon we were back on the road, forcing myself to focus on the dark asphalt ahead. I glanced at the clock, realizing how little progress we had made in what felt like an eternity. Each minute felt distorted, stretched out by the anxiety gnawing at me. As the highway wound deeper into the night, I kept checking the rearview mirror, certain that the towering figure was following us. But there was only fog and empty road. My partner stirred again, sensing my tension. I told him I was fine, not wanting to worry him until I could make sense of it myself. Finally, the road straightened out, and the forest receded into the background. The weight in my chest lightened, though it never completely went away. I spent the rest of the drive replaying what I had seen, my thoughts racing. Had I really seen a tree move? A cryptid? Was it just a shadow trick? But each time I recalled how it had vanished, I shuddered. The memory refused to feel like an illusion. We passed a sign that we were close to the state line, and I breathed a cautious sigh of relief. Maybe once we crossed into Kentucky, the night would lose its edge, and I could convince myself it had all been a creepy hallucination. But something deep inside me insisted that the memory would linger long after the fog cleared. As we drove on, I stole one last glance behind us, half convinced that the shape was still out there, hidden in the dark, watching us leave. Around midnight, I pulled into a truck stop, drawn to its dim neon sign like a shipwrecked traveler spotting land. Fat rain droplets tapped against the roof as I parked beneath a weak streetlight. Even in that dim light, the place looked run down. Faded paint, old vending machines humming in the corner, and greasy puddles on the asphalt. I sat in the driver's seat for a moment, letting the engine idle. My partner, now fully awake, looked at me with concern, no doubt sensing the tension radiating off me. I still hadn't told him about what I had seen earlier, and part of me didn't know how to explain it. It sounded insane, even in my own head. Reluctantly, we got out, needing a break from the winding road. The air smelled like diesel and damp concrete. The light above the pumps flickered and buzzed every few seconds, casting shadows that seemed to shift and shrink. That pulsing light kept me on edge. I couldn't stop imagining that giant figure from earlier, lurking just beyond the glow of the street lamp. Inside the convenience store, I grabbed a coffee while my partner stretched his legs. I opened a search on my phone, half embarrassed to look up keywords like massive tree creature and Missouri cryptid, hoping to find something that could explain what I had seen. But all I found were myths, local ghost stories, and unverified sightings. Nothing concrete. The lack of answers made me feel more isolated than ever. We stepped back outside into the damp night, and my partner started filling the tank. The lone attendant, an older man, approached with a polite nod. I blurted out something about how empty the road had been, and he just shrugged, glancing toward the dark highway as though he knew more than he was letting on. "We get travelers passing through," he muttered. "Some swear they see things this time of year." Then he went silent, almost as if he regretted saying anything. I wanted to ask him for more details, but I couldn't shake the feeling that he'd just shut down. My partner gave me a concerned look, probably wondering why I was so rattled. I forced a tight smile, hoping he would chalk it up to exhaustion. The truth was, my mind was still spinning with thoughts of that impossible sight. The longer we stood there, the more I felt the darkness closing in around us, like something enormous and watchful was standing just outside the circle of light. We got back into the car and pulled away from the truck stop, leaving the flickering neon sign behind us. The fog had thickened, swallowing the road so completely that I had to slow down. The headlights cast a faint tunnel of light, and everything beyond it felt ominous, as if it could spring to life at any moment. Less than 20 minutes later, the highway curved sharply through another stretch of dense forest. My partner finally spoke up, asking why I seemed so tense. I was about to give him a half-truth, blame it on the weather, when a tall, distorted shape appeared at the edge of the trees. It vanished almost immediately, but I caught a glimpse of something that didn't resemble any known animal. Long, spindly limbs brushing the branches aside. My partner glanced out his window, startled by my sudden intake of breath, but whatever it was had already melted back into the shadows. My grip on the wheel tightened as my pulse raced. I replayed the moment, It had moved again, silently and deliberately. I should have realized the night would be unusual as soon as Ben pulled up in the old car he'd borrowed from his older brother. Normally, we relied on beat-up skateboards or just our legs for these late-night outings, but having a car at our disposal made everything feel bolder. Ben's grin told me he was ready to push the limits, and Mark and Josh had that same spark in their eyes. We climbed into the car, the seats groaning under our weight, and my nerves began to buzz the instant Ben turned the key. The headlights sliced through the darkness as we backed out of my driveway, feeling like we were on some covert mission. No one mentioned where we were headed. We just drove, letting the empty roads lead us wherever they wanted. I tried cracking a few jokes, maybe teasing about the engine's squeaky belt, but my voice was strained. Deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that tonight was going to be different. The roads were empty, the moon hidden behind thick clouds, and the few cars we passed seemed in a rush to disappear. Even the signs, glowing under our headlights, looked old and forgotten, as if they had been left there for years. Mark nudged me from the back seat, whispering about how cool it would be to find an abandoned playground or factory to explore. I nodded, though I didn't feel as excited. The silence in the car felt heavier than usual, wrapping around us every time we stopped talking. Finally, Ben pointed at the fuel gauge, swearing as it neared empty. He said we'd pull into the next gas station. We found one not far ahead, an old, run-down place with a single fluorescent light flickering above. It looked like it hadn't seen a coat of paint in years, but it was all we had. We piled out of the car, stretching our legs and blinking at the dim glow. I took a few steps away from the vehicle to take in the area, the air tasting stale with a damp, earthy scent lingering in the breeze. That's when I noticed a sign at the edge of the lot, faded and peeling, but still legible, Forest Preserve Entrance. The moment I saw it, a chill ran through me, and I had this gut feeling we weren't supposed to be here. But Mark, on the other hand, was practically bouncing with excitement. He kept nudging Ben and Josh, suggesting we go check it out. Ben's eyes sparkled with mischief as he agreed without much convincing. Josh, half smiling, shrugged and said he was game for anything, as long as we didn't leave him behind. I watched them gather near the broken fence that led into the preserve, my heart pounding in my ears. I told them I wasn't so sure about this, maybe we should stick to safer places for once, but my hesitation didn't slow them down. They insisted it would be a quick peek, and that we'd find a trail leading to another gas station on the other side. I wish I could have come up with a solid excuse, some reason to make them stay, but all I could do was mutter a weak protest and follow them back to the car. My feet felt like they were made of lead, and that sense of unease grew stronger the closer we got to the treeline. The headlights briefly illuminated the first few trunks of the trees, their branches twisting overhead, and a knot formed in my stomach. I couldn't bring myself to step onto that path. Finally, I spoke up. "Look, I'll meet you on the other side," I said, trying not to sound too terrified. The plan was for them to cut straight through the woods while I walked around on the main roads. They teased me, calling me the cautious one, but I could tell none of us were truly laughing. Even they could feel that something was off. They insisted it'd be fine, just a quick trek, and off they went, disappearing into the shadows of the trees. I stood there for a moment, watching them vanish, feeling sure we'd crossed some unspoken line. My heart raced, but I forced myself to turn away, determined to stick to the roads. As I walked, the wind picked up, rustling the leaves behind me, or maybe it was just my imagination. Either way, I quickened my pace. At the time, I didn't know just how bad things would get, or what I'd find when I reached the next gas station. All I knew was that I didn't trust those woods, and with that nagging feeling trailing behind me, the open road felt like the safer choice. I kept telling myself it was just a 30-minute walk, but it felt like hours. The roads were deathly quiet. No headlights, no distant hum of traffic, just the soft crunch of gravel underfoot and my overactive imagination. Occasionally, I'd glance back, half expecting to see the others trailing behind me, but no one emerged from the darkness. Finally, the gas station came into view, a lone beacon of light in the distance. My relief was short-lived, though. As soon as I stepped onto the cracked asphalt, that weird tension in the air hit me like a wave. I looked through the glass door, hoping to see my friends. The clerk at the register gave me a nod, but he didn't seem concerned. Apparently, 3 frantic teens hadn't stormed through the door. I hung around by the coolers, trying to act normal, but the minutes dragged on. 10 minutes passed, 10 excruciatingly long minutes, and still no sign of Mark, Josh, or Ben. I started to wonder if they'd decided to head back to the car, or worse, if something had happened in those woods. I tried to calm myself with logical explanations, but it didn't help. The knot in my stomach grew tighter with every passing second. Just as I was about to ask the clerk if he'd seen anyone, I heard heavy footsteps clattering on the concrete outside. I spun around just in time to see Mark, Josh, and Ben tearing around the corner of the building, drenched in sweat, their faces pale, eyes darting nervously. I rushed to meet them, a mix of relief and fear bubbling inside me. If they were running, it meant they were alive, but their faces told a different story. They were shaken, rattled, like they had come far too close to something. We stumbled into the station's tiny seating area, their breathing heavy as they leaned over a plastic table, trying to catch their breath. It took a few moments for anyone to speak. Mark finally broke the silence, his voice shaking. "We heard something behind us," he said. "At first, it was just leaves crunching, but it kept getting louder, heavier. Then we saw it." Josh added his part, his voice cracking. "It was a figure, tall and pale, with red eyes. It was watching us." I froze, my mind racing. I'd heard the guys talk about creepy stories before, but never with such fear in their voices. Ben, his face pale, nodded. "We thought it was a deer or something, but it was wrong. It was too big, too fast." His voice faltered as he spoke. They explained how, once they saw those eyes, they didn't think. They just ran, tripping over branches and screeching in terror. "When we made it to the edge of the woods, it was still behind us, following," Mark said, his voice lowering. "But when we hit the road, it stopped. I turned around, and it was just standing there like it wasn't sure whether to follow us. And then it vanished. I asked if they were messing with me, but none of them looked the least bit amused. Josh's eyes were full of tears, though he tried to hide it. Ben looked like he was about to break down. We all knew it was time to leave. We huddled together outside, staring at the trees across the street, our nerves on edge. Every shadow seemed to twitch and shift, making me wonder if that thing was about to jump out at us again. Eventually, I snapped us out of it. "We need to get to the car," I said. My voice was barely a whisper, but it was enough to get us moving. The walk back to the car felt like a sprint through a gauntlet, our desperate need to escape making every second feel like an eternity. When we reached the sedan, Ben fumbled with the keys, and for a second, I thought he wouldn't get it open. My heart pounded in my chest so loudly I was sure everyone could hear it. We piled in, slamming the doors like they might protect us from whatever was out there. For the first few miles of the drive, no one spoke. We just stared out the windows, watching the empty streets and fields pass by. Every dark corner seemed to hide that same creature we'd left behind. By the time we reached our neighborhood, the sky was just starting to lighten, but the fear still gripped us. I'd never been so glad to see my driveway. We sat there for a moment, the engine ticking as we recovered from the night. Eventually, we mumbled quick goodbyes, each of us eager to get to the safety of our rooms. That night, or what was left of it, offered little rest. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that figure again, and I could hear my friends' frantic breaths. We'd always thought we were invincible, just a bunch of teens chasing thrills. But this felt different. We all knew, after what we experienced, that something real was out there. It wasn't just another urban legend. Whatever we had encountered that night had changed us forever. I woke up that morning with a strange mix of excitement and nervousness, thinking the trip to DeHill and Bunan Park would go smoothly. My cousins and I were squished in the back of my uncle's big SUV, laughing over who would get the window seat. We had snacks, music, and all the naive optimism in the world. If I'd known what was coming, I might have stayed in bed. The first issue came with the GPS, though I didn't see it at the time. We were so sure the fancy app would guide us flawlessly. My uncle, usually a cautious driver, trusted the digital voice telling us where to turn. The day started off sunny, with a sky so blue it almost hurt to look at. Everything seemed perfect, at least until we left the main highway. We found ourselves on a narrow road winding through thick trees. At first, it felt like an adventure, like we had stumbled onto a hidden treasure. My mom, sitting in the front seat, leaned forward and double-checked the map on her phone. She mumbled something in Tabuo, and I noticed the serious look on her face. She began asking my uncle to slow down, repeating it more firmly. The sunlight started to fade, casting a soft orange hue over everything, creating this eerie feeling that time was slipping away, like we had to find our way before the dark took over. The car's tires crunched on gravel as the path beneath us grew more treacherous. On one side, there were steep drop-offs, and on the other, dense trees seemed to close in. My stomach churned every time the car swerved too close to the edge. Eventually, the tension made my head heavy, and I started to doze off, hoping the rest of the drive would be smoother. Suddenly, my mom's voice became sharper, urging my uncle to be careful. I looked outside and realized the road had become dangerously narrow. It felt as though we were driving along a thin strip of land hanging over some unknown abyss. I tried to breathe slowly. My cousins, who had been laughing just a while ago, were now silent. One of them gripped the seat in front of him as if that would stop the car from tipping over. The air inside the SUV was thick with tension. I noticed how the trees seemed to press in on us, almost as if they didn't want us there. My uncle, trying to lighten the mood, made a joke about how adventurous we were, but I didn't even force a smile. I just wanted that part of the drive to end. We crawled forward, the headlights making everything look even more sinister. The branches cast strange shadows, like thin arms reaching for us. The sunset had almost disappeared, and now only our headlights illuminated the way. My mom's voice became louder with each bump, while my uncle's grip on the steering wheel tightened. Then, up ahead, I saw a slightly wider patch of dirt, maybe a place to turn around. Relief surged through me, but I was still on edge. My uncle slowly inched the SUV forward, the tires kicking up small rocks. This was the moment we'd been holding our breath for. Could we turn around without tipping over? The car felt like it was shifting as my uncle carefully turned the wheel, backing up in tiny increments. My heart hammered in my chest, and I was sure the others could hear it too. I watched in the side mirror as the car nearly scraped a protruding rock wall while the other side seemed to hover over emptiness. But my uncle kept going, following my mom's instructions as she checked the wheel clearance. When we finally completed the three-point turn, the car faced downhill again, and I realized my hands were shaking from the tension. My mom let out a relieved sigh, and my cousin exhaled sharply. Even my uncle, who had been trying to stay calm, wore a nervous smile that told me he was just as relieved as the rest of us. I looked outside. The road that had felt impossible only moments ago now seemed like the safest option. We began to head back, hoping we'd find a main road soon. My uncle sped up just a bit, and I allowed myself to believe that the worst was behind us. My mom kept watch, whispering that we had made the right choice by turning back. But I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't out of danger yet. The sky was growing darker, and we still had hours of driving ahead of us. Hours I feared would challenge our nerves in ways we weren't ready for. The car was filled with a tense energy, even as we tried to act normal. I stared out the window, wishing for city lights or any sign of civilization. The last of the daylight slipped away, and we all silently wondered whether our trip would end on a high note or if we were about to stumble into something even worse just ahead. My uncle seemed determined to find another route to Dahill and Bunan Park. We had already been on the road longer than planned, and the earlier scare still weighed on my mind, making each minute feel heavier. We had lost trust in the GPS, so my uncle relied on a vague memory of backroads he thought he had taken years ago. There were no streetlights out here, only the glow of our headlights casting long shadows on the trees. The night felt unusually dark, like a thick curtain we couldn't lift. I tried to look out the window, but all I could see was the reflection of our anxious faces. My mom sat up front, muttering that maybe we should pull over and wait until morning, but my uncle insisted we press on. He was sure the main road wasn't far. The road became rougher, loose gravel rattling under the tires. Every bump seemed to make the tension worse. The interior light was off, but in the dim glow of the dashboard, I could see the worry on my cousins' faces as they clutched their seats. I couldn't ignore the uneasy feeling in my stomach, the warning I couldn't shake. Then the SUV came to a stop. The headlights revealed that the road simply ended, as if a giant hand had ripped it away. My uncle turned off the engine, muttering that something wasn't right. Outside, the darkness stretched in every direction, and the silence was so thick I could hear my heartbeat. My mom urged him to step out and check for a hidden turn or a gap we might have missed. When he opened the door, a cold gust of air rushed in, carrying the smell of earth and dampness, like the area was trying to swallow us whole. I leaned forward, straining to see, but my uncle had disappeared into the dark. We all stayed silent, waiting, until his figure finally reappeared in the headlights. His expression told me there was no way out. He climbed back in, locked the door, and turned on the high beams. That's when I saw them. A row of figures standing just beyond the tree line. At first, I thought my eyes were playing tricks, but there were definitely people standing there, too still. My mom whispered under her breath, asking who they could be, but no one had an answer. The figures didn't wave or signal for help. They just stood there, which was even more unsettling. My uncle hesitated, as though unsure whether to call out or honk the horn. My heart raced as time seemed to stretch on. Finally, he put the SUV in reverse. The worry I felt intensified as we moved away. The figures didn't move, and the headlights swept past them. If they were travelers, they would have signaled, asked for help, or warned us. But they just watched. I must have drifted off in exhaustion, because the next thing I knew, the engine had a different hum. We were back on a paved road, and the lights of a city glowed in the distance. My mom pointed out a 7-Eleven, and my uncle pulled in. Felt like we had finally returned to reality. Climbing out of the SUV, my legs were shaky. The store's neon sign lit the parking lot in a harsh glow, and we hurried inside for food and drinks. My cousins snapped out of their daze and grabbed hot dogs and chips. My mom looked around, almost in disbelief that we were safe. Eating never felt so comforting, but every bite reminded me of the dark, quiet figures we had left behind. My uncle muttered that he would never trust that route again, and I was quick to agree. I needed a moment to process, but deep down, a more unsettling thought lingered. What if we had stayed just a little longer? Would those figures have come closer? Would we have disappeared without a trace? Though the danger seemed to be over, I couldn't shake the images of the watchers in the shadows. The question of why they were out there, so far from anywhere, haunted me far more than the thought of tumbling off that narrow road. The hum of the store's cooling system and the bright fluorescent lights offered a false sense of security. My mom patted my shoulder and asked if I was okay, but I just nodded, my gaze drifting toward the dark outside. A part of me remained in that forest, unsettled by the unknown. If there's one thing I learned that night, it's that not every road is meant to be traveled. Some places are better left untouched. I sometimes wonder if we were wise to leave when we did, or if we missed something we'll never understand. I'd been driving for what felt like forever, chasing the horizon in a half-conscious daze. The clock on the dashboard blinked 3:48 a.m., then 3:49, like the minutes were dragging themselves, taking forever to pass. The highway stretched endlessly in front of me, a straight and desolate line. The cold seeped through every crack in my old truck. A few times, I thought about pulling over to sleep for a bit, but every time I glanced at the fuel gauge, it was closer to empty, so I pushed on. When I finally saw lights, I felt a wave of relief, but that quickly faded when I got closer and saw what was waiting for me. It wasn't a busy rest stop or a well-lit convenience store, but a single, flickering streetlight above a small gas station that seemed stuck in the past. The paint had peeled off the walls, and the windows of nearby shops were either boarded up or covered with grime so thick you couldn't see inside. It looked like one of those sets from a low-budget horror movie. Quiet, still, and far too inviting for trouble. I got out of my truck, and the sharp cold hit me. My breath formed clouds of vapor in the air before dissipating into the night. The silence around me was so thick that every little movement felt magnified. The gas pump made a low hum as I swiped my card, trying not to think about how dark everything was beyond that single pool of light. Not a single car had passed me on the road. The whole place felt abandoned, like I'd wandered into a forgotten corner of the world. Then I noticed it. A sleek, black car parked at the back of the station, nearly hidden by shadows. At first, I hadn't seen it, probably because the car's dark windows and paint blended in with the darkness. Standing around it were 4 guys who looked completely out of place. Tattoos covered their arms, stretching over most of their exposed skin. They were wearing shorts, tank tops, and tall socks, acting as if the cold didn't bother them. The silence deepened as I realized they weren't moving or talking. They were just standing there, watching me as I pumped gas. My heart started to race, but I tried to stay calm, focusing on the pump like it was the most interesting thing in the world. The neon light above flickered occasionally, casting sharp, sudden light on their tattoos. I couldn't tell if they were waiting for me to notice or if it was just a coincidence, but the tension in the air was thick. Their eyes, barely visible in the dim light, seemed fixed on me, and there was nothing friendly in their gaze. They started moving toward me, slowly and deliberately, like they had all the time in the world. That's when I realized how truly alone I was. There was no cashier behind the counter, no other travelers stopping by, just me, my truck, and the half-lit station in the middle of nowhere. My mind raced. Should I greet them, pretend everything was normal, or just get out of there? Trusting my instincts, I quickly yanked the nozzle out of the pump, spilling some gas in my rush, and jumped into my truck. The engine hesitated for a moment before roaring to life. In the rearview mirror, I saw them getting closer, their figures looming larger. The overhead lamp flickered, casting their shapes in and out of light. It was unsettling enough that I didn't want to stick around to find out what they wanted. I slammed my foot on the gas, and the truck shot forward. The tires spun briefly on the cold pavement before gaining traction. I glanced over my shoulder. They were still there, just a few steps from where I'd been. I thought I saw a glint in one of their eyes under the dying streetlight. My heart hammered in my chest as I sped away, the gas station shrinking in the rear view. Part of me felt stupid for reacting that way. Maybe they were just harmless locals, but something about their silent, steady approach and the intensity of their stares told me otherwise. The town, or what passed for one, disappeared behind me, and I told myself I wouldn't stop again until I reached somewhere with plenty of neon lights and people. Little did I know the worst wasn't over. The road behind me wouldn't stay empty for long. Barely a minute after leaving the gas station, I saw headlights in the rear view. The harsh white lights cut through the dark like a warning. Rationally, I hoped it was just a coincidence. Maybe these guys were just heading the same way, out for a late-night drive. But something didn't feel right. My hands started to shake on the steering wheel, and every nerve in my body screamed. The lights got closer, fast, closing the gap between us. I floored it, my truck rattling under the strain. The engine roared as I pushed it harder, the cold air whipping through the cracked windows. I veered onto the main highway, tires screeching in protest. In the mirrors, I saw the lowrider car following, sleek and dark like a predator on the hunt. They stayed behind me for a few miles, their headlights flickering against the battered back of my truck. I prayed to see any sign of other cars, anyone else on the road, but the highway was as empty as the night sky. My truck shuddered again, but it kept going, thankfully. They probably assumed my old truck was underpowered, that it wouldn't be able to outrun them. That was a mistake. My heart was racing, and my breath caught in my chest as the engine roared louder. I leaned forward, silently urging my truck to go faster. My ride might have looked like a rust bucket on the outside, but under the hood was a performance-tuned engine, and for the first time I was thankful for it. They pushed hard, trying to keep up. I saw their headlights drawing closer in quick bursts, as if they were looking for a way to catch my slip. But each time, I pressed harder on the gas, feeling the engine respond, a deep rumble that matched the adrenaline coursing through me. The miles flew by in a blur, markers whizzing past. Slowly, the gap between us widened. Their headlights grew smaller and smaller, and eventually I couldn't see them at all. I didn't let up on the gas just in case. Even though I told myself they'd given up, something inside kept me alert, convinced they might pull some trick to catch me. But after a few more minutes of frantic driving, their lights vanished into the darkness. I let out a shaky breath, my heart still pounding. I pulled over to catch my breath, glancing at the rearview mirror just to be sure. There was nothing. No headlights, no lowrider. I let out a nervous laugh that didn't sound like me. Maybe this was the part where I should feel victorious, having outrun them, but instead, I just felt uneasy. Whatever those guys had been up to, I didn't want any part of it. Who knew what might have happened if they trapped me on that lonely stretch of highway? I didn't tell anyone about what happened until I made it to a town the next morning. After getting some strong coffee, I started telling a local friend, a cop, about the encounter. He listened closely, hardly blinking, and when I reached the part about the lowrider chasing me, his face said it all. He told me that road had a reputation for cartel runs, avoiding the main patrol routes. He said it so casually, as if it was just another piece of local knowledge. That's when it hit me. The tattoos, the silent confidence of those guys, and their cold stare. It wasn't just a run-in with some tough locals. They might have been after my truck. Maybe they thought I was an easy target, or worse, maybe they had something else in mind. He shrugged and told me I was lucky, that sometimes you outrun trouble before it gets you. Lucky, sure, but that relief was mixed with dread. I realized just how close I'd been to walking into something much worse. The memory of that flickering streetlight and those cold, watchful eyes stayed with me, and every time I thought about how still they were, my stomach twisted. From that day on, I swore I wouldn't stop at any more gas stations in the middle of nowhere. If I did, I'd just keep going, no matter how low the fuel gauge got. Some lessons come wrapped in fear, and this one taught me that out on those empty roads, anything can happen, and it usually does when you least expect it. I woke up before dawn, tossing my bag into the back seat of my dusty sedan, and waved at my wife, who was still groggy on the porch. We always exchange a few words before I head off, though neither of us expects anything exciting on that long drive through the desert. Once on the road, I called her again to keep myself company and settled in, resigned to the endless stretch of cracked earth and faded road lines. The sun slowly rose, turning the horizon a dull orange. Everything outside the window remained eerily still, like the desert itself was listening. My wife's voice came and went, the signal cutting out as I passed through dips in the terrain. To be honest, I wasn't really focused on our conversation. Instead, my eyes were glued to the road. A slight unease gnawed at me, but I couldn't place why. It was just a regular drive, the same as any other, but something about that morning felt off, like the land was trying to warn me. About an hour into the drive, I noticed a motorcycle up ahead. At first, it was just a flicker of movement. One rider hugging the road, weaving past tumbleweeds and sand patches. He seemed too calm, too confident. The speed limit in this area is already high, but he was pushing it even further, easily speeding between 70 and 90 miles per hour. My wife asked if everything was okay, likely sensing the distraction in my voice. I told her some vague excuse about traffic, but I couldn't stop watching him. There's something unpredictable about these desert roads. Sharp turns can appear right after a long stretch of straight highway, and although signs warn to slow down for curves, people often ignore them. Seeing him approach a particularly sharp curve at such a speed made my stomach tighten. I told my wife to hang on a moment and focused entirely on the motorcycle. The rider either didn't see the curve ahead or didn't care. He didn't slow down or lean into the turn. In a flash, he veered off the road. One moment there, the next gone, swallowed by the drop beyond the guardrail. Panic hit me hard, and I let out some startled noise into the phone. My wife's voice shot up in alarm, but I could barely respond. My mind raced with images of twisted metal and a figure crumpled in the desert scrub. I forced myself to hang up, unsure of what I might have sounded like, and jerked the wheel to pull over. The tires crunched over loose gravel, everything around me feeling surreal. The sun blinded me, and without thinking, I grabbed my phone and dialed 911. That was when it hit me. I might have just witnessed something no one should ever see. As the dispatcher spoke, I could hear my own ragged breathing. I grabbed my kit and stepped out into the intense heat of the desert, my legs feeling weak, almost as if they might give way. I peered over the edge, bracing for the worst, knowing whatever I found would change me forever. I almost dropped my phone as I scrambled down the slope, the dispatcher's voice faint in my ear. My hands trembled despite the heat, and each step sent gravel skittering beneath my boots. I expected to find the rider in a crumpled heap, but the drop-off was steeper than I thought. It felt like descending into a hidden canyon, where anything could be waiting. The dispatcher was still on the line, and I stammered details about the crash, the motorcycle going too fast, hitting the curve head-on. The dry air made it harder to speak. By the time I reached the bottom, I realized just how far the rider must have flown. Every instinct told me I'd find a tragedy, but as I rounded a boulder, I saw movement. For a second, I froze. Was I imagining this? A young man, maybe in his 20s, stumbling forward as if he was trying to shake off a hard fall. Dust covered his clothes, bits of sagebrush caught in his gear. His helmet dangled from his hand, cracked near the visor. He looked so disoriented that I thought he might collapse at any moment. "Hold on, buddy, stay still," I called out, my voice trembling. The dispatcher's questions were drowned out as I fumbled to stuff the phone in my pocket, trusting they'd pick up on whatever they could through the sound of my kit shifting. I jogged over to him, my heart racing, convinced he might topple over. Up close, the guy was covered in cuts and scrapes. There was a gash on his forehead, a thin trail of blood running down his face, and his collarbone was clearly broken, jutting out awkwardly. Still, somehow, he was moving, though every step must have felt like fire. I told him not to push it, that I needed to check him over. I ran a quick trauma assessment with gloved hands. No serious bleeding, breathing rapid but not labored. He muttered something about losing control, his eyes darting around like he was afraid the ground might open up beneath him again. I glanced back at the wrecked bike, now unrecognizable. The front wheel was twisted at a 90-degree angle, metal scattered in all directions. The fact that he'd survived being thrown that far was nothing short of a miracle. I remember thinking that if he could survive something like this, maybe I needed to respect the desert more or trust it less. I kept talking to him, trying to keep him awake, while the dispatcher repeated instructions about waiting for an ambulance. Within minutes, I could hear sirens approaching, cutting through the wind. I helped the rider to a safer spot, careful not to jostle his shoulder too much. Dust clouded the air as paramedics arrived, kicking up grit that stung my eyes. They rushed over, their expressions shifting from urgency to sheer disbelief when they saw him standing. They quickly put a neck brace on him, strapped him to a stretcher, and started carrying him toward the waiting ambulance. I followed them, adrenaline still rushing through me, replaying the moment he'd launched off the curve. I told the EMTs everything, his speed, how he hadn't even tried to slow down. One of them glanced at me and said, "He's lucky you were right behind him." But luck didn't even begin to cover it. Relief, yes, but also a strange unease, like I had wandered into a story with an ending I couldn't predict. When the ambulance finally pulled away, the sound of the sirens faded, and the stillness of the desert returned. I stood there, scanning the debris, trying to process what had just happened. My car waited up on the road, looking strangely insignificant against the vast desert landscape. The whole thing felt like a reminder of how quickly life can turn. One moment, you're cruising along the road, and the next, you're looking at someone who's just a heartbeat away from disaster. I trudged back up the slope, feeling drained, each step echoing in the quiet. By the time I reached my car, my phone was buzzing again. My wife, frantic about why I hadn't answered. I picked up mid-sentence, my voice raw. There was nothing supernatural about what I'd seen, but it had rattled me more than any ghost story ever could. All I could think about was how close that rider had come to disaster, how quickly everything had turned into a nightmare, and how even with him in an ambulance, the desert still felt like it was watching, like it had more to show me. I climbed into the car, took a moment to steady my breathing, and turned the key. The engine's rumble felt strangely normal after everything. As I pulled back onto the highway, I told my wife I'd explain it all when I had a better grip on what had happened. The road looked different now, less predictable, more ominous. Every curve seemed like it might be hiding another disaster, waiting to happen. I tightened my grip on the steering wheel, determined to stay alert. Nothing around me had changed, but I had, and somehow, I knew I would never see that stretch of desert in the same way again. On a random impulse, I decided to drive down Old River Road at about 2:30 a.m., dragging a couple of friends with me. We figured we'd drive until we felt that unsettling thrill that only the darkness can bring, that eerie quiet when the world seems off balance. But as soon as we turned onto that road, I knew something was different. It was as if the temperature had dropped the moment we passed the last streetlight. Even the air felt denser. Out of nowhere, the fog rolled in. One minute we could see the road clearly. The next, we were creeping along, trying not to drive off into the trees. The headlights barely cut through the milky haze, and the whole scene looked like a dream or a nightmare. The car grew quiet as the driver eased off the gas. I found myself gripping the door handle, my heart racing, unable to explain why. After a few minutes, someone in the back spoke up, asking if we were sure about this. That question planted a seed of doubt, but I kept telling myself it was fine. We weren't ghost hunters, just a group of night owls looking for something interesting. Still, the emptiness of the road pressed on my mind. It was like the fog was hiding something watching us, though I couldn't spot a single living thing around. Soon, my eyes locked on a faint shape ahead, barely visible beyond the headlights. At first, I thought it was just mist swirling in odd patterns, but the driver cursed under his breath. He saw it too. He slowed down to a near stop, trying to make sense of what we were seeing. I leaned forward, squinting, my pulse racing. The shape was strange, box-like, but the edges rippled like it couldn't decide if it wanted to stay solid or fade away. I felt my nerves spike, and everything inside me screamed to get moving. But before I could speak, one of my friends in the back started shouting. They were pointing up at a huge tree, screaming they saw a large, hairy figure with claws scraping the bark. I swear, all I saw was a flicker of movement, maybe just the wind shifting a branch. But my friend's panic made me question what I'd seen. The driver slammed the gas pedal and we shot forward, the fog thicker than ever. The engine roared, and everyone was shouting. Fear twisted around me like a vice, and I half expected something to crash into us. It felt like the road itself was trying to trap us, the mist pressing in on all sides. My chest felt tight with pure panic, but somehow we broke through, and the fog began to lift. We found ourselves on a clearer stretch of road, the air suddenly feeling lighter. We all sat there, catching our breath, but none of us could shake the feeling of dread. Had we really seen something, or was it just our minds playing tricks in the dark? Either way, if what we thought we saw was real, I wasn't sure I wanted to know more. It wasn't until we got further away that the tension began to ease. Each of us started talking at once, describing different versions of what had happened. The driver couldn't stop thinking about the shape near the tree. The others were still reeling from the creature in the branches. I didn't know what to believe. All I knew was that I'd never felt a place so unfriendly, and I was more than ready to get as far away from Old River as possible. When we finally stopped on a wider road, we all stayed in the car, locked up tight, just sitting in silence, trying to understand how a simple late-night drive had turned into something so unsettling. I don't remember who finally broke the silence, but they voiced exactly what I was thinking. We're never going back there. No one argued. In the days that followed, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that fog-covered road and the strange shapes that had haunted it. It was the same for all of us. We couldn't shake the fear. We texted late into the night, sharing our fears and theories. Some thought it was just a wild animal, but others insisted it was something more. As the hours passed, curiosity crept back in, and despite the dread gnawing at us, we agreed to go back, to prove we weren't losing our minds. Part of me screamed to let it go, but a stronger part of me wanted answers. We waited until midnight before driving back down the same road, the tension thick in the air. As we got closer to Old River Road, I felt my nerves tighten. The fog was completely gone tonight, as if it had never been there. We slowed down near the spot where everything had gotten weird. The towering tree looked different now, its branches clearly outlined in the headlights. There was no sign of that strange, transparent box or any bulky creature clinging to the trunk. We parked at the side of the road, hearts pounding, but we kept the engine running, like it might be a lifeline if something jumped out of the shadows. I stepped out, half expecting something to charge at us from the dark. The air was cool, unnervingly quiet. I walked up to the tree where we'd seen the strange thing before, shining my flashlight up the trunk, hoping for some clue. A tuft of fur, footprints, anything that might explain what we'd witnessed. The bark had deep scratches, but they could have been there for years. No footprints, no fur, just the tree swaying in the breeze and our shared unease. I kept scanning the area, my flashlight flickering over the trees, convinced a clue might appear. But after a while, we decided we'd seen enough. That's when paranoia hit. The idea crept into my mind. Were we being watched? We didn't hear anything except our own nervous breathing and the occasional rustle of leaves. Feeling foolish, we left quickly, back in the car and away from the tree. We drove aimlessly for a while, not wanting to go home just yet. We ended up in an empty parking lot, all of us jumpy and still shaken. We swapped stories we'd heard about Old River. Tales of a hooded figure in black, strange cries echoing through the trees, shadows slipping past drivers. Some of the stories sounded ridiculous, but after what we'd seen, I wasn't ready to dismiss anything. For the next few nights, the unease stayed with me. Each time I turned off the lights in my room, I felt that thick fog creeping back into my mind. Every time a branch tapped on my window, I jolted awake, terrified something was trying to get in. My dreams were even worse. Being stuck on Old River, shining a flashlight on a yellow-eyed creature perched on a tree, and waking up in a cold sweat. The others had similar dreams. One friend heard footsteps outside their window, while another saw strange movements out of the corner of their eye. We started to wonder if any of it had been real, or if it was just our imaginations running wild. But the fear wasn't leaving us. I tried to put it all behind me to go back to normal, but every time I glanced at the map and saw how close my house was to that stretch of road, my stomach twisted. The thought that whatever we'd seen was so close to home made me uneasy. Rumors began spreading about others hearing strange cries or seeing hooded figures at dawn. Each new story kept the anxiety alive, but even though I kept telling myself I'd never go back, part of me wanted to understand what had happened. What was it about that place? Why did the fog roll in like it had a mind of its own? And what were those strange shapes? For now, though, none of us had the courage to investigate again. We'd learned our lesson, whether it was a strange animal, something supernatural, or just our collective fear. Our nightmares were bad enough. We stuck to the familiar, well-lit streets, tried to carry on with our routines, and held on to the hope that whatever was out there would stay far away from us. If it decided to find us again, though, I didn't think we'd be ready to face it.